Episode of Sector Head Spotlight. I appreciate everybody tuning in. We are live on YouTube, and I've got the pleasure of having our telecom policy sector head, Paul Glenchur, on with me today. It's going to be a little bit different style here, where he doesn't cover a sector per se, but he's still got a lot of juice and a lot of process back in his policies, and we all know him from the call. So it's a pleasure to have you on, sir. Thank you very much, Paul, for taking the time to do so this morning on March Madness Thursday.
Yeah, thanks. Looking forward to tip-off. Get those
Absolutely.
brackets in, everyone.
Exactly. So for those that are kind of new to watching in to this webcast, typically what we do is we'll go through Paul's background, how he landed at Hedgeye, and then expand on his process, and lastly finish up with some themes for 2023 and things that are kind of important on his horizon, and that should be on yours as well. So with that, Paul, if you don't mind, maybe this is going to be a fun one, because although we've met a number of times, I haven't actually had the pleasure of hearing the background, how you landed at Hedgeye, and I know you've been at Potomac for before it became part of
Right.
Hedgeye, I guess, right? So
Potomac Research.
yeah, Potomac Research, exactly. You and JT. But yeah, I'll pass it over to you, sir. And if you don't mind, maybe again, we don't have to go all the way back to the beginning, but I would love to just sort of hear about the story of how you landed here at Hedgeye.
Sure. Well, first of all, I was born at a very early age, um, like some people, like others, not the only one. I've got a pretty heavy legal and regulatory background, and after law school out in California, I clerked in the Federal Court of Appeals for the Ninth Circuit. I think my year we were reversed by the Supreme Court like 26 times, but I never drafted for my judge an opinion that got reversed. So I can at least claim that. Then after that was in Washington, working actually in congressional affairs for the Energy Department. Went into private practice for a couple of years, largely doing energy type or tax litigation, and was involved in, at that time, I believe, the biggest tax case in history involving Exxon and taking oil out of Saudi Arabia, how that was taxed. But I wanted to get into communications. So much was happening, and the firm didn't do a lot of that. And I actually went over to the FCC, worked there doing cable and telecommunications regulatory issues. And then actually Schwab, which had a big institutional business at the time, came calling. And I had done some work looking at the Federal Communications Commission and how some of the regulatory actions could affect markets and investments in the companies that are regulated, and sort of took that, as well as my ongoing fascination and love for the markets, over to Schwab. And from then on, actually, has been involved in a number of positions where I'm looking at the regulatory climate from an investment perspective, and trying to handicap the outcome of proceedings that have some pretty significant impact for the companies and the sectors that I look at. And it's actually broadened out a little bit. I'm more than happy to help out. I've been on with the guys in Staples, and looking at it from the aspect of even potentially going into things like healthcare and Obamacare and such, and looking at legal issues that affect other sectors. And you'll find me once in a while joining some of the other sector heads as we look at antitrust and regulatory issues that can affect their companies. So we're beginning to broaden out a little bit, and it's a fascinating time to be doing this kind of work.
Yeah, and again, talk about being timely with the announcement of TikTok. I know you had a great conversation with Freebird recently, aka our sector head of communications, Andrew Friedman. And yeah, so if you haven't watched that, for those at home, you can subscribe to either the policy research or to Sector Pro Communications, and you'll be able to get access to that. But it was a great conversation, and I know you're going to touch base on it a little bit here today, because I think it's a key theme for 2023 for you. But going on along the commentary about kind of the litigation, your time in court and trial and all that kind of stuff, I know one of the things that I find very, very interesting and fascinating about part of your process is that you do end up going in and sitting in the courtroom at different different levels, right? And most more specifically, I remember when I first sort of joined Hedgeye in terms of consuming the research aspect, not from wearing the jersey, but you know the Sprint and T-Mobile was a big merger that was transpiring, and that was in the news. And so yeah, so I believe, if memory serves, you were there. You sat in on that, on the communications and the trial that were going on for about a 2 week period, and then a few months later, it then actually hit the news. So would you mind maybe just expanding on kind of that piece of puzzle, and we could perhaps even use the T-Mobile Sprint as an example?
Yeah, that was a case where a number of state attorneys general brought suit to block that merger. And I think after the trial, I went up there. It was held in New York. It was a 2 week trial. Then went back for closing arguments, and there's a lot of briefing involved and a lot of witnesses, a lot of testimony. You sit through those trials, because people have a lot of interest in them. A lot of them are players. I sat through that when I sat through AT&T buying Time Warner as well. That one was in Washington. That one was logistically a little bit easier to handle. But in the Sprint T-Mobile case, after a couple of weeks, I think most of the people on the street would tell you they thought that the judge, who was a Democrat, was probably going to block the deal. That's just not what I heard. And a lot of times it's just there's no substitute for really listening carefully to what witnesses are saying and how the judge is reacting. It was not a jury trial, it was a judge trial. And just the way I read it, even though I think it was against the weight, it was against the consensus, I just felt like it was leading to a decision that he probably would let the merger go through. And I gave my reasons for that in my research. And we made that call, and probably a little bit more than a month and a half later, the judge did approve the merger going through. And I think Sprint stock rallied like exponentially on that news the day it was announced. But that's how a lot of people play it. And it also has big impacts across the sector because it's consolidating it with impacts on pricing and service and the entry of Dish Network as a potential wireless facilities-based provider. There was a lot of ripple effect involved with it as well. So that was one of the cases that we looked at, and sitting through the trial makes a difference. Same thing for AT&T Time Warner. I thought it was pretty clear the judge was not going to block that merger, and of course that's exactly what happened as well. It went through. They unwound it subsequently. Didn't play out the way that the companies hoped, but in terms of getting the deal approved, with the investment impacts and the stock impacts, we called that one right.
Yeah, and so along those lines, I mean, if we kind of take that to the next level, they obviously, that merger created the third largest wireless carrier in the U.S. here, and 5G's been the broadband and the spectrum, I should say, excuse me,
Yeah.
is a big piece, because I know there's some up for auction, correct, Paul, in terms of this year, or that's being
Well,
sold, or
yeah, no, not. There's nothing really planned at this point. I
okay.
mean, there's some. That's one of the issues that's involved. The Congress has actually let lapse the Federal Communications Commission, the FCC's authority to conduct spectrum auctions. They'll get it back eventually. But what that's really all about is they have to come up with just more spectrum. I mean, look at what we're using our wireless devices
I
for
know.
everything, right?
Yeah.
In high definition video and everything else, streaming everything, and you need more wireless capacity to do that. And the carriers would like to get more of that spectrum, but the problem is we're kind of out of it. I mean, you can go way, way, way up the upper frequencies and find some spectrum, but that doesn't propagate well. So a lot of the sort of mainstream spectrum you want to use for your devices, it's been claimed, it's tied up. So one of the interesting themes in my space, I think, is this whole idea that the government has to get more spectrum to the market, and the Defense Department using it, satellite companies are using it. So how do you sort of repurpose and shift spectrum positions around to optimize how it's used to get more spectrum to the market for everything that we use spectrum for these days? And so I think that actually is one of the themes. How do we auction off more spectrum? How do we get it to the market? How do we pay for it? And how does that affect like infrastructure spending? Cell tower stocks, for example, telecom equipment vendors, and companies that actually help in managing congested airwaves, because sometimes they just have to be shared. The Defense Department might use a band of spectrum that actually commercial wireless providers like an AT&T or Verizon might be able to access from time to time. So how do you work that out, and who helps coordinate all that? Companies like that could benefit in the long run as well. We try to spot those kind of opportunities when we talk about the regulatory issues that we do.
Yeah, and that's where I think that it's a great segue into the next phase of this conversation. But I think that's a critical piece from a policy standpoint, right? In terms of both you and JT on the call and the snippets of information that you deliver to us and specifically to Keith. And it's about kind of more the long term. Well, it's both near term and long term, right? In terms of some of the actions and policies that are going to be put into place, or that are going to be sort of voted on or what have you, right, in the very near term, but then also what's on the horizon in terms of what could shake up an industry or what could change the way that to your example, the tower companies may have from either a capex standpoint or a backlog standpoint or what have you, how is that going to impact them as well in say if something like that, if spectrum does come to the market over the next kind of 12 to 36 months.
Right.
And I think it's a critical piece, and you do a phenomenal job on that. I actually cut my teeth, interestingly enough, Paul, in the telecom space. So when I first started in this business, I was a research associate, and we covered telcos and telecom, and I did it in Toronto in Canada, but we were going through, at that point in time, the Canadian equivalent of the FCC. They were, there's a lot of spectrum auctions. So I did a lot of research back then in the mid 2000s, and it was a big deal back then because cell phones and that kind of thing were obviously really gaining speed, and I joked with Ami last week about the BlackBerry and Palm Pilots
Yeah.
and all that kind of stuff, and let alone where we've come 15 years later, and the amount of content that we do consume via our mobile devices, and BlackBerry really no more with iPhones coming
Yeah.
in. Yeah, right. So
They're
anyway,
antique collectibles, Robert. I mean, you might be able to sell them. You might be able to sell them,
exactly.
make a little bit of cash.
Exactly. So yeah, no. So thanks for that, background on the process side of things. What, if you don't mind, maybe we can kind of pivot. You just touched base on what I would consider a key theme here in 2023, probably going into 2024 from a spectrum standpoint. But are there any other type things that are on the horizon that you think are quite topical? And I know TikTok's obviously in the news, and you put out a
Sure.
great note this morning. We don't necessarily have to get into the TikTok piece right now, but I'll kind of pass it back to you in regards to there's another big merger, obviously, in the marketplace that I know you've had some great commentary on, which would be the Activision and Microsoft one. And so, maybe we go that direction, and or
Sure.
some fiber optic, that kind of thing, right?
Oh, sure.
Yeah.
There's a number of pretty big themes out there. And of course, one that you read about like every day, right, is, you know, we use these platforms. It's your Apple phone, it's the App Store, it's your Google phone, your Android powered phone using the Google Android system. It's um, Google Search, it's Amazon e-commerce, right? It's Facebook, it's Instagram. I mean, these digital platforms, they're ubiquitous, and regulators kind of decided they're getting too powerful. They're buying up future innovators, with potentially stifling innovation by shutting it down with these acquisitions. And so there's this sort of this current regulatory belief that we have to really put the brakes on these platforms, or at least start regulating them, more aggressively. And it covers, it's not just a Democrat Republican thing. I think that you see people on both sides trying to be very cautious about where how these platforms lead innovation, how they integrate you know privacy into what they do, how do they protect privacy, are they doing enough, are they going to engage with artificial intelligence vehicles to perhaps not just compromise people's privacy even more, but to actually drive conduct out there among users that could be harmful. So you see all of this stuff going on, and it's every day now. Some sort of, whether it's here in the United States, or it's in Europe, or it's in the UK, or elsewhere, they're all clamping down on these guys. And I think that and how that works out creates a number of social, cultural, and political challenges, but also investment opportunities or risks along the way. And I think that's just something that we just have to live with as it all works out. Um, then at the same time, you have the need for some consolidation in some legacy industries, whether it's broadcast television or whether it's the satellite direct broadcast satellite guys. You begin to see whether some of the legacy businesses need to consolidate to survive. That's another big issue. You talked about the Microsoft Activision situation. That's obviously one that within a few weeks could all get resolved. Microsoft trying to buy Activision Blizzard, and a lot of attention focused on the Call of Duty game that I've never played, but I can tell you one of my two boys plays it a lot. It's a pretty important game as far as content for gaming platforms, and Sony opposes this acquisition, and you've got the European Union, the UK's Competition and Markets Authority making decisions in a few weeks, and you've got the Federal Trade Commission suing to block it. And despite all of that, I still think there's a pretty good chance they can get it done. The EU should be deciding it by around mid to late April, and around the same time that the CMA in the UK makes a decision. And they could very well approve it with licensing conditions. And if there's any litigation, some of that litigation might take a while. And but I think Microsoft, basically on the merits of what they're trying to do under most competition and antitrust standards, probably has a decent case to make for why they should be able to acquire it. Sony is actually a bigger player in the console market than the Microsoft Xbox. So you're seeing all these deals. I mean, every day now it seems you see Microsoft cutting a deal with someone for, cloud platform type gaming and such, to sort of communicate that if they do this merger, all of these entities will have Call of Duty, will have Activision Blizzard games to be able to compete. And potentially bring it to even more users than have access to it now. So I think that's a big fight. There's a $95 cash takeout per Activision share. The stock's been trading around 78, 79 of late. So there's potentially some upside here if they can get that deal closed. So yes, we're watching that one really carefully. And other thing,
Sorry, Paul. Just what kind of a read through would you have if that deal does go through? To like an EA Sports type thing. Is there anything there? I mean, would Sony? Would it be possible that Sony kind of tries to go after and takes this from an FTC and a European, from a regulatory standpoint, and say, okay, like if this Activision deal goes through, they might be able to be a little bit more aggressive with trying to acquire larger players in the space, like an EA Sports.
Well, it's an argument
Or
that definitely.
I should say it's not just EA Sports. That's what I grew up playing EA Sports, but it's just Electronic Arts. I should make that clarification. Excuse me.
Electronic Arts.
Yeah,
Sure.
Tiger Woods. Tiger Woods.
Take-Two is out there. There's a number of gaming, publishers out there. So yeah, it certainly could create an environment where there could be some responsive consolidation. There has been a lot of speculation about that. I mean, mostly people are just so focused on Sony's really aggressive efforts to try to block this deal.
Okay.
And we'll see how successful they can be at stopping this or dragging it out. But sure, consolidation can breed consolidation. Although remember, it's we won't get into the details of this, but a lot of what kind of regulatory pushback you get is whether they want to look at a merger as being a horizontal competitors, head-to-head competitors, or buying an input that potentially other competitors might want to have access to, a vertical deal, they call that. And whether, because sometimes it's harder to get a horizontal merger through than a vertical one. So a lot of it depends on the markets that you're talking about and, how they want to characterize them as horizontal or vertical. This Microsoft Activision deal, there's some horizontal aspects to it because Microsoft has, Halo and they have Minecraft. So, I mean, they are adding horizontal gaming content, but mostly the fight is over the vertical aspects and whether it forecloses somehow the Sony PlayStation or other subscription or mobile game operators and that kind of thing. So a Sony, EA deal, see how they would look at it. It would have both, vertical and horizontal aspects to it.
Gotcha. And so when you were referring to like Sony trying to block this merger, how for those that and again I actually don't really know how they how they do this, but what kind of tactics do they use? Is it do they appeal to the court or like do they send in documentation to the FTC? Like how does that actually work?
Yeah, all of that. We're not in
Okay.
the court yet, but I mean, the regulatory agencies and all of them get filings and meetings with Sony saying why they, think this deal is bad, why it's bad for competition. And Microsoft comes back and say, well, what do you expect the leader in the console market to be saying? Wants to defend,
Okay.
its market position, and you should, discount what they're telling you. So they're going, back and forth across the pond with the FTC and going to London and going to Brussels and making the pitch. And we're getting to the point though where the clock is running out and they're hitting decision deadlines in Europe. And but by the end of April, we are going to know what they plan to do with this. So,
And
but
just
yeah,
to
that's
clarify,
how you
that
do
is
it.
that's the deadline is the end of April, at least in Europe, or is it also here in the
Yeah,
FTC?
I think actually it was interesting. There was an April 11th deadline
Okay.
that the EU had, and April 26th for the CMA in London. The CMA has been pretty aggressive. I mean, they're probably the biggest regulatory obstacle to the deal. In fact,
Interesting.
even with the FTC suing to block it, I actually think the CMA in London is the bigger problem for Microsoft, that they try to work through it. But then the EU moved to their deadline to April 25th. The UK's CMA is April 26th, although there's a chance they could go before that. So we're
Okay.
getting to the end of the line, and it's interesting because if the European Union had decided to go early and say April 11th, there could be a small window of time there where the companies could actually close the deal legally, even though there'd be ongoing challenges against it. But now that the EU has moved the deadline to April 25th, it's so close to the CMA deadline that, for the most part, they're going to go together. In fact, it wouldn't surprise me if London goes first by a couple of days. I think there's some coordination in terms of their timing, among all of these regulatory entities. So we're
Interesting.
getting close. We're getting very
Interesting.
close.
Well, I don't know what the signal looks like on Keith's official vest, but I'll tell you what. In last month, that ATVI price action looks pretty favorable to perhaps be front running this opportunity or potential kind of positive outcome from a regulatory standpoint. But we'll see. Time will tell, right? Time will tell.
Yeah, I think that's right.
Awesome. And I know the next one, the other kind of topic that you highlighted for me earlier was the kind of what's happening in the fiber optic space here in the U.S.
Right.
Would you mind kind of just expanding on that?
Sure.
Thank you, sir.
It's interesting, and again, these what's interesting about the regulatory climate, and the process here in Washington is, companies spend millions of dollars lobbying and joining associations that lobby on behalf of their interests, and they do that because they're trying to shape the markets that they will compete in. And so a lot of times you can sort of detect long-term trends that can play out, particularly for investors if they want to, participate in that. One of them is interesting to me is this whole fiber optic build. Everything is moving faster, and the demand on our networks is just increasing exponentially. And it's almost like, the analogy, if you buy a house with a huge closet, it's empty, but you're going to find a way to fill it. And it's sort of like we build this massive capacity into our networks and we find ways to fill it. And more and more, I think the demands of the network have driven us to think that the most future-proof way to build out a network is fiber optic. And to trench lines in the ground or sometimes overhead that you can just continue to add capacity and have more robust networks in perpetuity with fiber optic cables. And I think the government wants that. The government accepts the fact that, particularly in some of these rural markets where people don't have very good broadband, that they can make a huge once in a generation investment to try to build that out. And some companies will benefit from all that, not just carriers who can get subsidies for building broadband to customers that could be otherwise pretty expensive to reach. but equipment companies and vendors who sell into that environment, and the government has over $40 billion in subsidies pursuant to some infrastructure legislation that was passed a couple of years ago, that they're going to start spending that money, and when they do, it sort of runs through the system, and some of these vendors benefit a lot. We've looked at companies like Corning that makes the fiber that these companies will put in the ground. A company like Clearfield, which it's been a volatile stock. It's not a large cap company, but they make sort of rural fiber solutions, and we're trying to build more in these rural areas. Potentially, they can benefit. Certainly, they've said they can. Then a company like Mastech, which is a construction company. They do a lot more than just telecommunications. I mean, they do a lot of construction across a lot of verticals, but they have a sort of a telecommunications unit that helps to build out, that helps out with wireless infrastructure deployments, as well as these sort of wired fiber optic ones as well. So there's a number of players who can benefit from these trends.
Is that MTZ Mastech?
Yes, it is.
Okay.
It is. So I mean, these are the again, it's sort of a long-term play out. I mean, there's other issues that have to be resolved. There's some question about whether, telecom providers who get these broadband subsidies that have been promised to be distributed, whether they're taxable. Believe it or not, they may be taxable, which means that money goes back to the government instead of going into the ground to build these networks out. There's issues about, whether they know really the best places to build all of this. And so they're depending on the Federal Communications Commission to help them develop, maps of the least served areas of the country who need this build out the most, and to make sure that that's where we're prioritizing the money. So there's a number of things that sort of can drag the process out. But in the big picture sense, there is this big, gigantic commitment that we're making to spend billions and billions on getting these networks built, and there will be beneficiaries of all of that spending.
Yeah, for those at home that may not remember, it's a $42 billion over 5 years. That was part of the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act.
Right.
So that's what Paul's referring to. And just to reiterate, some of the names here again, not investment advice, but Corning, ticker is GLW, Clearfield, CLFD, and then Mastech, MTZ, for those at home. But yeah, and the timing wise, you're thinking kind of back half of the year, right?
Yeah, there have been some requests because they're struggling to make sure that they prioritize the money to the right areas of the country, but if they can roll the money out where they can have a good sense about how they want to distribute this, where the priorities are, I think that'll start to run. They're pretty committed to getting it done in the third quarter, beginning to spend this money.
Gotcha.
We'll see if they stay on track with that. But
And just to clarify, those the driver there, or the people committing that capital, is that primarily driven from the U.S. government?
yeah, the Commerce Department will send money to the states. The states then will distribute it to the various areas.
Gotcha.
The FCC is putting a map out there to sort of prioritize the areas. Then you figure it all out. Where are the priority areas? Therefore, to fill it all out, how much per state needs to go? The Commerce Department will distribute the money to the states, and then the states will take it, and then they'll distribute it to the localities that need it the most.
And I'm assuming if anybody wants to kind of like quote unquote track this, it's public. That map's public info on the FTC's website.
Well, yeah, I mean, the FCC, and there's a number of challengers who come in and believe it can be the map can be improved. It's pretty complicated. I don't think everyone wants to torture themselves going through all of that. But if you're a glutton for punishment, I guess you could begin to dig into all of that. But
or if you want a shortcut, you just come subscribe to Telecom Policy, right, buddy?
Right. There you go. I think the thing is, from an investment perspective, right, you just want to focus on the companies that stand to benefit. It's also interesting, we were talking about TikTok earlier. Some of these rural markets, they're using Chinese equipment in their networks that, for the most part, we've banned. We've said we're not going to allow that. Same thing, TikTok and words about Chinese espionage. There's words about Huawei equipment, and which works well and is quite affordable. And a lot of carriers said this is great to deploy, but there's concerns about, whether it's a backdoor way for them to perform espionage and that kind of thing. And so get it out. It's not safe. And some of these smaller carriers that have a lot of money, they it's hard for them to take that equipment out. Customers need service and they don't have the money to rip it out and replace it with something else. And so, going back now, Robert, to what you were talking about on Spectrum, a lot of those Spectrum sales we've been thinking about, raises money for the government. And the thinking of the Congress is that they'll take some of that money, send it to those rural carriers so they have the money to take the Huawei equipment out and make their network safe for their users and their subscribers. So you see how, the hip bone's connected to the thigh bone,
Oh
et
yeah.
cetera. And here we are talking about, TikTok, cat videos and teenage dance videos. And here's Huawei equipment, you know, physical network equipment that the US government has said that stuff's not safe, get it out of your networks. And we're relying on it every day in some of these
Right.
rural markets
Yeah.
because they want to take it out. They've been told to take it out, but they don't have the money to take it out.
Yeah,
So,
that seems like that
the
might
money
be a little
needs
bit
to
of a
flow.
larger issue than just TikTok, eh, bud?
Yeah,
But
I think that's right. I think
yeah,
that's right.
but I love how you brought that full circle. I appreciate that, Paul. It's wonderful. Your wealth of knowledge. I think this conversation could clearly go on for another hour. There's so much policy, and again, it's fantastic. So thank you for spending time with us this morning. I greatly
Sure.
appreciate it. You gave us a couple actionable tidbits there. Again, if anybody's interested at home in learning more, or kind of getting greater access to Paul's research, you can subscribe to the Policy Sector Pro product, and listen to Paul and JT on the call as well, which comes on every day, every morning, 7:45. But with that, I thank you for your time today, and look forward to sitting down with you guys again next week, same time, same place, Thursday. Actually, it's going to be in the afternoon, 1 p.m. Excuse me. There's going to be a great conversation with Keith, the real conversation next Thursday morning. But with that, Paul, I appreciate it, sir. I hope you have a great rest of your day.